Only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. In today's webinar we will be discussing subjunctive. My name is Dan and my colleague Zach is here to answer any questions you might have throughout or at the end of the webinar. So please send those in at any time. As you do work through your Spanish course, if you have any questions or need any help, there are numerous ways you can get in touch with us, as you can see on the slide right now. So please don't hesitate to let us know how we can help. If you do have questions for Zach today, you can answer them here at the bottom of the screen. So today's objectives. In today's webinar, we will discuss all forms of the subjunctive and their uses, translations, and verb types and conjugations. The present subjunctive, the imperfect subjunctive, and the subjunctive perfect, and we will also do some practice sentences throughout. So let's start with an introduction to the subjunctive in general. What is the subjunctive? As you can see, it's a simple tense. That means it's a tense that's made up of one-part conjugations. Before we get into the perfect discussion, that describes actions of uncertainty, such as hopes, desires, and possibilities. The subjunctive expresses actions that have not yet happened and they may never happen at all. Okay, it's looking ahead to the future for things that are possible, but doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to occur. And this contrasts with things you may have learned previously in indicative moods, where the actions have undoubtedly occurred, such as present tense, somebody does something on a regular basis. Preterite, somebody already did something once. Imperfect, somebody was doing something in the past, etc. So subjunctive has a lot of uncertainty involved, and you're not quite sure if that action is ever going to take place. Okay, so here are some triggers for the present subjunctive. As you can tell, as we mentioned previously, they have to do with hopes and desires and wants and fears. Also doubts, possibilities, requests, and suggestions. So if these verbs, as the note says at the bottom of this slide, if these verbs are expressed in the present tense, meaning the ones above, typically they're the first part of a present subjunctive sentence. For instance, I hope that somebody visits me this weekend. I want you to finish your homework. A teacher might say to a student. If these verbs here in this chart are used in the present tense, as the note says below, then the next verb or verbs typically will have to be used in the present subjunctive. So when you say something like, I want you to finish your homework, at that point, that action has not happened yet. The homework is still in progress, or maybe it hasn't even been started yet. So if I presently want you to potentially or possibly do something, first verb in the present indicative, second because it's occurring already, not potentially happening, but the second verb is the one that could potentially happen, therefore it is needed in the present subjunctive tense. And we'll show you some examples of that, and as well as this second note. If, however, the verbs above are shown in the conditional tense, something that would happen, preterite tense, something that happened, imperfect, something that was happening, or past perfect, something that had happened, if those verbs on this chart happen in any or are shown in any of those four tenses, then the imperfect subjunctive is needed for the verbs that follow, the next verb or verbs. And we'll show you something there. It would be like saying, I wanted you to finish your homework before dinner. Now we're looking back. Dinner is here, not quite sure yet before the person who was doing the homework has answered or confirmed whether they did or did not finish it. So there's still uncertainty, but that's looking back as opposed to the one previous rule where we're looking ahead to the future. So it's all very context dependent, and we'll try to explain that and show that to you as we go forward here. All right, so we're going to continue here with our discussion of present subjunctive and how to conjugate regular verbs, meaning how to allow a subject and a verb to agree in this tense when something may potentially happen in the future. And there are two steps to conjugating a regular present subjunctive verb. As you can see them on the slide here, first step is to drop the infinitive ending. So you're going to remove the AR, the ER, or the IR from the infinitive verb, leaving you with the stem. And then you're going to add the subjunctive endings, the present subjunctive endings, to that stem. And there are two sets of regular present subjunctive endings in Spanish. AR has one, and ER, IR, much like present, preterite, and imperfect, they share a set. And they're basically looked at as quote-unquote opposite endings. So if you notice, the AR verbs all begin with the letter E, and sort of vice versa. The ER, IR verbs all begin with the letter A. So present subjunctive, also known as opposite endings within the tense. None of these endings have accent marks. I will show you some examples of how to conjugate these more specifically as we move forward. And those would be pronounced a, ace, a, amos, en, a, as, a, amos, and an. All right, here we just have a few examples of regular present subjunctive conjugations. Hablar, to speak. I might speak to him later, or I hope that you speak to him later. This is the conjugation you would use in a present subjunctive context. It's an AR verb, and it takes those opposite endings that we just discussed on the previous slide. Same thing kind of applies to the next two verbs, comer, to eat, and escribir, to write. ER, IR verbs take that set of A endings. So coma, I might eat. I hope that you eat. Comas. And then escriba, I might write, I may write, etc., etc. So you're simply dropping the infinitive ending, the AR from hablar, adding the endings that start with an E, the opposite present subjunctive endings we saw on the last slide, and doing the same for ER, IR with the other set of endings beginning with A's. Okay, so two steps to conjugating regular present subjunctive conjugations. As far as how the present subjunctive sounds or translates from Spanish to English or vice versa, we have a few possibilities here. Sometimes present subjunctive conjugations can translate all five of these ways within an individual sentence, and then it's really just up to you to determine which one you like best or fits best within your context. Other times, maybe one or two at most might fit, not the others though. And that's all sentence dependent. So your five possible translations are shown here. May or might, those would be the most common and the most relatable present subjunctive translations. I might go to the store later. Hasn't happened yet. It's not definite. It's uncertain if I'm going to go. There might be some variables that keep me from going to the store. Something that somebody should do, I think that he should apply to college very soon. Present subjunctive. And then the last three, all right, depending on the context, the present subjunctive can come across just like present indicative. I hope that he goes to the store. He goes sounds like present, but in that case, it has to be conjugated to the present subjunctive. I doubt that he will go to the store. Future. The word will is another possible translation or sound of the present subjunctive. You would have to have a trigger, like the verbs we saw earlier, to hope, to doubt, etc., to conjugate to the present subjunctive. If you just simply say, he will go to the store more definitively without a trigger, then they would actually conjugate to the future tense in that case. But with a subjunctive specific trigger, then you need to conjugate to the present subjunctive, and it can translate sounding like the future tense. And then it can sound like an infinitive, meaning it can have the word to as part of its English translation. I want you to do your homework. In Spanish, you can't set it up just like that, exactly word for word in English. You're going to need the word que to come into play. Literally saying, I want that you do your homework. But in English, it's more common to translate as, I want you to do your homework. So even though it might sound like an infinitive, it might translate that way, the verb to do in that case, hacer, would have to actually be conjugated to present subjunctive because you haven't done your homework yet. It's a request. It's something that somebody wants, a desire, a hope, etc. So like I said, sometimes, depending on the sentence and the verb, all 5 of these might make sense. Other times, really only 1 or 2 may make sense. Context dependent. All right, here we have some example sentences, okay, similar to some that I've already mentioned. So the verb dudar, to doubt, shown in present first singular, is the trigger here. When you doubt that someone does something, in this case that she eats vegetables, comer is an ER verb. If you doubt it, you don't know it, it's uncertain, can't possibly put it into an indicative tense, so present subjunctive is the required conjugation there, coma. It does not have an E ending like it would in present tense because it's uncertain. Example 2 is one of those infinitive ones that I mentioned at the bottom of the last slide. I want him to speak. In this case, if you notice, one thing that both of these examples have in common is the use of the word K, relative pronoun K. Literally, I doubt that, or I want that, in number 2, he speaks or speak to the manager. The second one, we don't really say it that much or that often or that commonly in English. That's why the infinitive makes more sense. I want him to speak. But in Spanish, if you have a subjunctive trigger followed by a subjunctive conjugation, the word K has to come between the 2 of them. And that's present in both of these examples. So that's something important to keep in mind. The use of the relative pronoun K to connect a present indicative trigger with a present subjunctive conjugation. Can have a present subjunctive sentence that's triggered by one of those verbs we saw earlier without the use of K. Absolutely has to be there, even though it might not translate into English. All right, and you should notice that use of K in both of these examples as well. All right, 2 more present subjunctive examples. I think that you should write the essay soon, or just simply I think you should write the essay soon, which is quite fine in English as well. Regardless, K must be there in Spanish. Pienso, the trigger, present tense, indicative, followed by the next verb being formed in the present subjunctive. You haven't written the essay yet. Soon implies it may very well happen, but it might not happen at all. And then the last one, using hacer to deal with weather. Hace calor, you might be familiar with that to say that it is hot out, but in this case, it's probable, based on the forecast, that it will be warm tomorrow. Since the trigger is there, es probable que, that's why haga in this present subjunctive can sound like future tense, will be, but cannot conjugate to the future tense. If somebody just simply said, it will be hot tomorrow, they knew it, there's really no uncertainty about it, then the future tense can be used. But because the trigger is there, es probable que, then the verb has to be in the subjunctive. It is a subjunctive specific trigger. Okay, so just 4 prime examples of how to use present subjunctive within different contexts, triggered by different things like phrases or verbs. Okay, we're going to transition here, but I'll give you a minute. I see we have some people who may have some questions, so if you do have any questions for Zach, feel free to send them in now, and I'll continue here shortly. Okay, on this slide, we're going to transition from present subjunctive to imperfect subjunctive. Okay, I made a mention of that briefly earlier, but we'll talk about it here in more depth. All right, as you can tell, it is triggered by tenses that are different than the ones we spoke of earlier. Okay, it's triggered by the preterite, the imperfect, the conditional, and the past perfect. Okay, it's used to look back at things that had been requested to have been done in the past, but may not have ever necessarily taken place. Okay. It may also be used to look ahead, referring to something that might be needed of someone. So we'll talk about how to conjugate, how to form a regular imperfect subjunctive verb and then we'll talk about more of the use and some examples. So in order to be able to properly conjugate a regular imperfect subjunctive verb, you must follow these 3 steps. And in order to be able to master the imperfect subjunctive, you must have a good mastery of the preterite tense, because all of these conjugations are rooted, as you can see in step 1, they're rooted in preterite conjugations. So a lot of unusual irregular conjugations in the preterite tense. If you've studied that at all, you might be familiar with some of those irregularities. So you would start by conjugating the verb to third person plural preterite if you're trying to conjugate to the imperfect subjunctive. Then you would drop the RON. All third plural preterite verbs are going to end in RON. And then you would add the following endings shown in the chart below. Okay, pronounce ra, ras, ra, ramos, and ran. And if you note at the bottom, there will be an accent applied here, but only in first person plural on the vowel that comes before ramos. So if it's an AR verb, the accent will be on the A. If it's an ER-IR verb, the accent will be on the E. And we'll show you that in some examples as we move forward. One thing different here compared to present subjunctive is that there's only one set of endings here. If you notice, all AR, ER, and IR verbs take the same set of endings within this tense. A little bit different than present subjunctive. All right, so here we have a few examples, okay, and conjugations and sentences in the regular imperfect subjunctive. Andar is the verb to walk. If you think about its preterite form, as you can see up top below the verb itself, if you said they walked, preterite tense is anduvieron. It's an irregular verb. And then our other example, hablar, that's a regular verb in the preterite to say they spoke or they talked, hablaron. Both of them ending in RON, because ARON and IERON are the third plural preterite endings. And as we said on the previous slide, you would remove that RON, add the RA, etc. endings, and be able to conjugate to regular imperfect subjunctive. So anduviera, okay. And then if you notice in that chart, anduvieramos has an accent on the E, as the last note said on the previous slide. For first person plural only, it's always on the vowel before the ramos ending, and you can tell that is applied on the A as well in the example of hablar. No other accents for any other person in these. So initially we stated that, tenses like preterite, I asked, pay D on the bottom, and conditional, I would need, are 2 of the 4 triggers, along with imperfect and past perfect, that would force you to use imperfect subjunctive as opposed to present subjunctive. So I asked that he walk to the mall today. Maybe I couldn't give him a ride for whatever reason, or I just wanted him to meet me there. Pay D is in the preterite, and the next verb, andar, is in the imperfect subjunctive. I asked him to walk there. I'm not sure if he ever did. Okay, I have to talk to him to see if that occurred, but it's looking back. And again, you can also look ahead depending on which trigger you have. I would need you to speak at the meeting tomorrow. Hypothetically speaking, all right, since necesitaría is in the conditional, then the next verb has to be in the imperfect subjunctive. Could never be in present subjunctive in that context with that trigger. So the triggers are important for both of these tenses. Definitely something to go back and review. All right, and finally we have the subjunctive perfect tense, which is a compound, not a simple tense. And that just means, unlike the previous 2, its conjugations are made up of 2 words at least, not just 1. Okay, and it is used to express what someone may or might have done in the past. Emphasis on have. I might have watched the movie if I had enough time. Okay, I didn't have time for whatever reason in the past, I didn't watch it. So subjunctive perfect is a good way to express such an action. And to form that, you would have to conjugate aber to its present subjunctive form, which is shown on the bottom left, H-A-Y-A, pronounced aya, ayas, aya, ayamos, and ayan. That means I may or might have, you may or might have, etc. And then you would form the past participle of the main verb. Right, if you've been with us, or if you've reviewed or looked at the previous webinars on compound tenses and passive voice, we've talked about past participles there a lot. We've actually just recently put together some more resources for past participles. You can find that on our academic resources page. But a past participle in Spanish, just to quickly review, is formed by dropping AR and adding ADO, or dropping ER-IR and adding IDO to the stem of the verb. And we'll show you here how that is formed. So the verb cantar, to sing. If you were to say that I might have sung, a few songs if I had an opportunity, haya cantado. As long as you hear may or might followed by have, you know you have a form of subjunctive perfect, a compound tense. Okay, and there's that example of it below. He might have sung at the concert 2 weeks ago. We're not quite sure if he did. All right, I have to check with him. Él haya cantado. Haya, third singular, to agree with el, and cantar is your verb, so you drop the AR and add ADO. Okay, just a little bit about 3 forms of the subjunctive. All right, definitely important as you move forward with your Spanish course. You'll be seeing quite a bit of this. If you still need further assistance with it, don't hesitate to let us know. There will be a second part to this. There's more to the subjunctive than we discussed today, and we will be hosting that webinar on Thursday, May 23rd at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you'd like to register for that, we'd love to have you. All right, if you have any questions for Zach, feel free to send those in at this time. Again, if you have questions for us as you're working through your program and your course, there are numerous ways to reach us on your slide in front of you now. Okay, we do want to thank you for your time and attention. All right, if you have questions, let us know. And as always, buena suerte. Good luck in your Spanish program. Have a good day.